The protagonists. The principal roles in that unfolding tragedy were played by Galileo, the Aristotelian scientist, the Jesuits, the Dominicans, and Pope Urban VIII. It is hard to sort out the precise nature and interrelationship of the roles, but each was significant to the drama. Galileo. The central character was a mathematician, physicist, experimenter, inventor, entrepreneur, musician, writer, polemicist, and debater. Galileo was a crusader, but he was not a zealot who rushed to a fray without a strategy or knowledge of his foes. His letters and books reflect a personality that was prudent through feisty. In his polemical writing as well as his scientific research, Galileo weighed the evidence and framed careful conclusions. He was aware of social customs and political realities in both state and church. Over his long life, he formed friendships with a wide variety of intelligent and powerful men who remained loyal to him through thick and thin. As a polemicist, Galileo was a potential danger to the university, state, and church. Yet 2 Grand Dukes and many high church officials, including 3 judges who declined to sign a sentence, continued to trust him, knowing that he fought for just causes. Galileo's long crusade was waged primarily for Copernicanism, and at least not as a new philosophy. Giordano Bruno, 1548 to 1600, had refuted Aristotle's natural philosophy and broadened Copernican theory into a new metaphysics, without introducing another scientific methodology. For Galileo, however, the Copernican conception offered mathematics, mechanics, and astronomy. He advocated the pursuit of science to explain natural events, free from the control of any philosophy, whether old or new. During his campaign, Galileo was concerned not only for science but also for his church. When his academic enemies made their controversy a theological issue, he fought to keep the church from tying biblical teaching to Aristotelian science. Galileo was pressing less for ecclesiastical approval of Copernicanism than for the right of science to develop in its own domain free from authority of theology. And he saw no need for a breach between science and theology, since God is the author of both books, of nature and of Scripture. If the church were to forbid anything, it should be the imposition of scriptural authority found in scientific debates, which should be settled by experience and reason. Number 2. University scientists. From his 30 years before the conflict took a theological turn, Galileo waged a running battle against the Aristotelianism of the scientific establishment. He effectively used the media of private discussion, public lecture, and polemic writing. Although his attacks were not personal, Galileo's opponents were understandably hurt and angered as he undermined the scientific system and professional reputations. Imagine a very similar situation today in the physics department of a prestigious university. A new student professor with a 3-year non-tenure track appointment turns the students against the fundamental presuppositions of the textbooks, openly criticizing the theories of the department head, a Nobel Prize winner. For good measure, the upstart broadens the attack in public lectures for the popular language of a bestseller. How long would he be allowed to continue such a campaign? Attempts by his department to break or buy out his contract of the first semester might make the peasant professors of the 17th century look broad-minded by comparison. It's curious that, despite the evidence, historians of science have said and blamed the university professors for their part in the decision against Copernicus and Galileo, their opposition to freedom of scientific inquiry. Yet it was they, the leading scientists, who urged the theologians to intervene, confident that the church would be on their side. In a letter to a friend in 1635, Galileo wrote about the events leading to a church's fateful decision against the Copernican system in 1616. Galileo did not blame the young priest, Cassini, who had denounced him from the pulpit in his own city of Florence. He incidented the men whose slanders, frauds, stratagems, and trickeries were used 18 years ago in Rome to deceive the authorities. As for the present, you have certainly understood from my writings which was the true and real motive that caused the underlying mask of religion, this war against me that continually restrains and undercuts me in all directions. Number 3. Dominicans. Thomas Aquinas, the 13th century angelic doctor from whom Thomism gets its name, had embraced Aristotle's natural philosophy. Aquinas was a Dominican, and his order remained faithful to teaching. Suspicious of any innovation, even if only astronomical, they vigorously opposed Galileo. Some, like Lorini Cassini, preached against him. Other Dominicans, however, authorized the publication of Galileo's dialogue in 1632. Number 4. Jesuits. At the beginning of the 17th century, the Jesuit order exerted great cultural influence within the church. Their ranks at the Roman college had eminent scholars of mathematics, physics, and astronomy. They sought to keep new research within the pale of orthodoxy so that it enhanced the church's authority. During the period in question, the Jesuits vacillated the issue of Copernican astronomy. Officially, they stayed on the sidelines of the 1616 controversy, although several influential Jesuits gave Galileo indirect support. Ironically, the two orders changed position in 1632. The Jesuits inspired accusations against Galileo and criticized the Dominicans for authorizing publication of the dialogue. Two Jesuit astronomers on the faculty of the Roman College, Chenier and Grassi, were definitely Galileo's enemies. Angry over his attacks on the scientific views, they considered Galileo's writings in Italian a threat to the educational program. They may have been influential in bringing him to trial. It was the Jesuits who informed the Pope that under rhetorical method, dialogue made a convincing case for Copernicanism. They also told Urban that he was being ridiculed by having his argument against the tidal theory put into the mouths of Simplicio. Since Urban had presented that argument directly to Galileo, he felt his friendship betrayed. There is no evidence that Galileo meant to ridicule the Pope, but the damage had been done. The Pope, who considered himself an intellectual, felt that he was not being taken seriously. Out of favor with the Jesuits for allowing the dialogue to be published, he feared that they might turn on him, especially after they assured him the issue was potentially more dangerous than Luther or Calvin. Thus, the one group that should have been warning the Pope not to take the fateful step of drawing the Church into scientific controversy instead led him into the quicksand. Number 5. Pope Urban VIII. In the end, the Pope proved to be the pivotal figure. Those turning against Galileo was largely the result of the forces beyond his control. The astronomers Schreiner and Grassi were motivated by long-term malice. Urban's anger sprang from a frustration suddenly produced by converging pressures. Urban's international politics had backfired. His undercover alliance with the Protestant Gustavus Adolphus of Sweden became known when that king suddenly died. Pope had alienated Austria with nothing to show for it, and he had been ill-used by Cardinal Richelieu of France. On the home front, he faced criticism for sacrificing the Church's interest to personal ambition, the greed of his relatives, and interest of the House of Barberini. Moreover, he had been forced to move swiftly to crush a political plot within his own curia. He began to see enemies everywhere and lived in fear of poison. Galileo's apparent perfidy was the last straw. The Vatican had given permission for the publication of the dialogue after assurance that all would go well. Now, Urban felt deceived by his old friend and began to worry about repercussions from such a popular book. After trying to aid the new science, he felt double-crossed by Galileo's mobilizing of lay opinion against the intellectual authority of the Church. It was time to act decisively, he thought, to recoup some prestige and to reaffirm his position as head of the Church. So he appointed a commission of theologians to review the dialogue, the action that led directly to Galileo's summons and trial. Two other events hardened Urban's opposition to Galileo. First, the injunction of 1616 was recovered from the files, possibly by Schreiner, and shown to the Pope. As an unsigned memorandum, it was of no legal value, but it declared that Galileo should not discuss Copernicanism in any way whatever. It appeared that Galileo had disobeyed a legal order of the Holy Office and, despite the many controversies, had failed to tell Urban of the injunction. Second, the report of the trial delivered to the Pope in June 1633 is supposed to be objective, gave an inaccurate and biased picture of Galileo's case. Sent up without the actual trial documents, it served to confirm the Pope's grievance against Galileo and stiffen his resolve for strong action. The verdict on the verdict. The decision was made on June 16th after Urban returned to Rome and met with the congregation in the highest tribunal. He overturned the arrangement with Galileo approved by the judges, most of whom were Dominican, issuing a decree that the defendant should not be interrogated, required to recant, and then imprisoned. The Jesuits had won the day against both a scientific enemy and a rival religious order. In light of those facts, one should be wary of accepting the traditional interpretation of the child, exemplified by Colin Ronan's conclusion. Galileo does stand as a classic example of the evils of totalitarian regime. He cut right across the religious authority of the Church. It was essentially Galileo's danger to an authoritarian outlook that caused his downfall. Ronan cities is a parallel to the Linsko case in Russia, where scientists were tried for daring to hold Mendelian concepts. Ronan's conclusion is a curious mixture of truth and error. He's close to the truth when he calls Galileo the victim of an authoritarian outlook. The problem is that he points a guilty finger in the wrong direction. To call the Catholic Church in the Italy of that time, a collection of independent states, a totalitarian regime is an anachronism. The Pope hardly had the power of a modern dictator. For example, if Galileo had stayed in the Republic of Venice when he had been recently expelled the Jesuits for political intrigue, he would have been safe. The real authoritarianism that engineered Galileo's downfall was that of the Aristotelian scientific outlook in the universities. Only after Galileo had attacked that establishment for decades did his enemies turn their controversy into a theological issue. Even then, it was the natural philosophers who worked behind the scenes with papal church authorities to foment Galileo's trial and finally to rob him of the reasonable solution worked out by the Inquisition. Those activities are dismissed by residents simply as human nature. A more accurate assessment is given by Santillana. In reality, it was a confused free-for-all in which prejudice, invertebrate rancor, and all sorts of special and corporate interests were prime movers. It has been known for a long time that a major part of the church intellectuals were on the side of Galileo, while the clearest opposition to him came from secular ideas. The tragedy was the result of a plot which the Heracles themselves turned out to be the victims no less than Galileo. An intrigue engineered by a group of obscure and disparate characters in strange collusion. Galileo's last years. On June 30th, 1633, Galileo was released to the custody of a friend and former pupil, Archbishop Ascanio Piccolomini in Siena. Despite strict instructions that Galileo could see no one, his host invited many visitors to the palace. Soon the two friends were busy at work on new scientific projects. In December 1633, the Pope allowed Galileo to return to Florence. Instead of going to prison and stay at Galileo's small farm near Arcetri, Urban kept his promise that the old man should suffer as little as possible and continue the pension that he had granted in happier days. Although under house arrest for the remainder of his life, Galileo was glad to be home and near his daughter Virginia, Sister Maria Celeste. Her regular letters had helped some sane him in Rome, and now she could personally attend her father's needs. Her death in April 1634 was a grievous loss to the old scientist. Despite his new sense of loneliness, he resumed his scientific activity. Prohibited from discussing Copernicus, Galileo returned to the questions of motion and applied mechanics. Those subjects allowed him to chip away at established views and demonstrate the power of mathematical reasoning. And they would also prepare the ground for discussing planetary motion again. The edict should be reconciled or forgotten. Most of all, Galileo wanted to complete a long-planned book, which became his greatest contribution to the new science. All this was a remarkable agenda for a man of 69 who had just emerged from years of controversy and trial by the Inquisition. Galileo's Discorsi e dimostrazioni matematiche intorno a due nuove scienze, Discourses and Mathematical Demonstrations Concerning Two New Sciences, was a masterpiece of scientific prose. Like the dialogue, it took form of a discussion and with the same three participants, Salviati, Sagredo, and Simplicio, considering various topics over a number of days. In the first 2 days, they discussed the new science of strength of materials, and they spent a few days on the problem of motion. During the last 2 days, they considered theory of proposition and precaution. Throughout, Aristotle's teaching sustained a thorough going over. Galileo comes remarkably close to the first law of motion that Newton defined 50 years later. This course was substantially completed in 1634, although Galileo continued to perfect it over the next 3 years. The manuscript was smuggled out of Italy and published in Leiden in 1637. Although he was chaffed under house arrest and prohibition against replying to his Aristotelian opponents, in the end Galileo had the last word. During 1637, a progressive disease deprived the scientist of the sight in his right eye, and finally made him blind as he was planning to conclude his career with 2 more books. His son Vincenzio and a pupil named Viviani became stenographers for his prodigious correspondence with scholars all over Europe. During his last years, Galileo enjoyed a constant stream of stimulating visitors. He also continued research on sound, problems of dissonance in mathematics, and on a mechanism for a pendulum clock. Galileo had been deeply hurt by the trial's verdict's vehement suspicion of heresy. He did not withdraw from the church. He went on praying and asking his friends to pray for him. He even planned a pilgrimage to the shrine of Loreto. Galileo's own coincidence as a Catholic and as a scientist was clear. Even though the church had turned its back on him, he blamed only some wrong-headed individuals. I have 2 sources of perpetual comfort. First, that in my writings there cannot be found the faintest shadow of irreverence toward the Holy Church, and second, the testimony of my own conscience, which only I and God in heaven thoroughly know. And he knows that in this cause for which I suffer, though many might have spoken with more learning, none, not even the ancient fathers, have spoken with more piety or the greater zeal for the church than I. The real cause for which he suffered was freedom of scientific inquiry from both the university and ecclesiastical establishments. In November 1641, Galileo was confined to bed by kidney pains, heart palpitations, and a slow fever. His 2 pupils, Viviani and Torricelli, stayed with him constantly. Although weak, he enjoyed listening to the scientific discussions. On January 8, 1642, a month before Galileo's 78th birthday, Viviani wrote, With philosophic and Christian firmness, he rendered up his soul to its Creator, sending it, as he liked to believe, to enjoy and to watch from a closer vantage point those eternal and immutable marvels which he, by means of a fragile device, brought closer to our mortal eyes with such eagerness and impatience.